understand the value of wood, but if forest owners are selling raw logs to go offshore just to be used in wasteful boxing, how is that contributing to long-term sustainability?
So with this agreement, actually, the environmental goods that are included are largely processed, as I understand it. So I'm really here in support of us doing more processing onshore.
You are. That's great to hear from the forest owners.
If you look at the 45 wood products, they are all processed. So the more we can process in New Zealand and send offshore, the better.
Yeah. Great.
Dr. Lawrence Yunnan.
Thank you. Following up from Honourable Damien O'Connor's question, if we are looking at, you mentioned before, wood, well, I guess wood products in some of these cases will be considered as environmental good, and you're talking about economic growth and et cetera, et cetera. How does an increase in the number of freights and the emissions that is generated from freights be considered beneficial to climate change and the environment?
Well, we're really looking at efficiencies in that space for multiple reasons. One is that forestry and wood processing are really concerned about our overall environmental footprint. We're focused on meeting climate obligations. That's one of our cornerstones and one of the things we're proudest of in forestry is that, trees are the ancient and proven technology that we have that works really well right now for sequestering carbon. And we'd like to see more recognition across the value chain of both how we can sequester carbon in buildings and through that wider forestry and wood processing value chain, but also how we build efficiencies in there. And part of that is based on the emissions, but also is based on the fact that global shipping right now is under pressure. Mm-hmm. So it's sensible for us to look at agreements like this that recognize the environmental goods, but also encourage us to keep making those efficiencies along the supply chain.
Supplementary question, just on the part you mentioned about sequestration. Can I just check that when you're looking at environmental goods, do either of you separate what is considered environmental good or wood product as a result of a monoculture or as part of something that we are looking at in terms of increasing, let's say, indigenous biodiversity and et cetera? Is that, you're the experts. Is that something that you would consider, or are they all lumped together as environmental goods, whether they're part of a monoculture, pine forest, or anything?
So just trying to understand the question, we're supporting wood products. We don't export indigenous wood products offshore. Okay. So I just trying to work out how the question's related to the export and processing of wood products.
I could take a stab at it if you like. So in terms of what kind of wood we're producing, I think it's important to recognize that the reason we have the pine monoculture in New Zealand is because we were conserving our native timbers. Mm-hmm. So that took the economic pressure off of native timbers, which, at the turn of the 20th century were used for butter boxes and things that were really short-term uses. And by having a pine and Douglas fir and some of these other forestry that are exotic species, but having those species, we were able to continue to produce timber for housing and timber for shorter term uses that then wasn't impacting on our native forests. So we do have programs around diversification, both in the non-native space, and then there's still a small native forestry industry. It is largely domestic, and there are folks that are interested in looking at whether or not we could grow that. I think we would need to do that. I don't know that would necessarily end up being tied to an agreement like this, because if we were going to increase trade in that space, we would want to do it very carefully so that we didn't have unintended consequences on those native forests. So we've got a really good regime under the Forest Act to manage those forests for some timber right now, but it needs to be a really high value product. And if you're going to use native timber, there's also questions about the intellectual property and indigenous communities. And I think there's a lot to unpack in that space. Yeah. And so right now, the system we've got is focused on sustainable production of exotic species. I think there's space for us to open that conversation back up about using other species for production. but we'd want to do that in a really considered way, so we don't go back to a system where we're exploiting native forests beyond what's sustainable.